By the time the men realized what she was doing, the first row of saplings was already in the ground. They stood in a straight line along the windward side of her cabin. Thin, flexible stems no thicker than a wrist, spaced carefully and planted deeper than seemed necessary for something so small. From a distance, it didn't look like protection. It looked like decoration. Or worse, wasted effort. "She's farming trees now," one of the men muttered as he watched from the road. Another shook his head. "Those won't last a season out here." The woman working the soil didn't respond. Her name was Martha Ellery, and she had already lived through a winter that taught her exactly what the wind could do. It wasn't the cold that had nearly driven her out of the valley. It was the movement, the constant, relentless movement of air that stripped heat from everything it touched. Last winter, she had kept her fire going nearly every hour of the night. Still, the cabin never held its warmth. The moment the flames dropped, the cold rushed in. Not slowly. Immediately. It came from one direction more than any other, the long, open stretch of land to the north, where nothing stood between her cabin and miles of empty field. The wind didn't just hit the walls. It wrapped around them, slipped through gaps, pressed against every surface until the inside temperature matched the outside faster than she could fight it. That was the part no one talked about. They spoke about insulation, about thicker walls, about better stoves. But none of it mattered if the wind never stopped. Because moving air carries heat away faster than anything else. That was what she had noticed. And once she saw it, she couldn't ignore it. The idea came late in the season, after a night where the wind had howled without pause. Martha had stepped outside at dawn, exhausted from feeding the fire, and noticed something strange along the edge of the property. A cluster of wild shrubs, thin, tangled, and mostly ignored, had caught the snow. Behind them, the ground was different. The snow lay deeper, undisturbed. The air felt calmer. That was the moment. Not a solution yet, but a direction. The shrubs hadn't stopped the wind. They had slowed it, broken it, changed how it moved. And that had been enough to create a difference she could feel. If something that small could do that, what could something deliberate do? She spent the rest of that winter observing. Not the fire, not the walls, the wind. How it moved across the land. Where it accelerated, where it slowed, where it broke apart. By spring, she had made a decision. She wouldn't try to fight the cold directly. She would change what carried it. The first saplings came from the edge of the river. Young trees, flexible and strong enough to bend without breaking. She chose them carefully. Not for height, for resilience. Because winter didn't respect rigidity. It punished it. Each tree had to survive the wind, not resist it completely. That was the difference. She planted the first row early in the season, before the ground hardened, before the soil lost its moisture. Each hole dug deeper than necessary, each root set firmly, because if the trees shifted, the entire system would fail. That was the first layer, stability. The second was placement. She didn't surround the cabin completely. Not yet. She started where the wind was strongest. The north side, the open side, where nothing had ever blocked the air before. Turner was the first to approach her directly. He stood at the edge of the row, looking down at the saplings as she packed soil around their base. "You planting a forest?" he asked. "No." "Then what is this?" Martha straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "A barrier." He looked past the trees to the open field beyond. "That won't stop anything." "It doesn't have to." Turner frowned. "Then what's the point?" Martha glanced at the line of saplings. "They don't stop the wind," she said. "They break it." That was the difference. Not force against force. Interruption. Turner didn't look convinced. "They're too small," he said. "For now. And by winter, they'll be enough." He shook his head. "Seems like a lot of work for something that might not even matter." Martha didn't argue, because he was thinking in absolutes. She was thinking in degrees. The first row was only the beginning. Over the next weeks, she added more. A second line behind the first. Then a third. Each one slightly offset. Not straight through, because straight lines allow wind to pass cleanly. Offset lines disrupt it, force it to change direction. That was the system forming. Not a wall. A filter. By midsummer, the rows had taken root. Leaves filled out. Branches spread. The space between them no longer looked empty. It looked intentional. People passing by noticed. And they commented. "They'll die in the first storm. Too thin to do anything. Why not just build a thicker wall?" Martha heard all of it. But she had already tested the idea. Even in summer, the difference was visible. stand on one side of the rows, and the breeze moved freely. Step behind them, and it softened. Not gone, but reduced. That was enough. By autumn, she expanded the barrier, curving it slightly around the cabin instead of leaving it flat. Because wind doesn't approach from one direction alone. It shifts, wraps. That was something she had learned the hard way. The shape mattered as much as the material. A straight barrier protects one side. A curved one protects the structure. The final addition came just before the first frost. Low brush layered beneath the saplings. Not tall, not strong, but dense. That mattered, because wind doesn't just pass above. It moves along the ground. That was the layer most people ignored. By the time winter approached, the cabin no longer stood alone. It sat behind something living, something that moved, something that changed the way the air behaved before it ever reached the walls. From a distance, it looked unusual. A cabin wrapped in uneven lines of young trees. Not symmetrical, not traditional. That was why they laughed. Because it didn't look like protection. It looked like uncertainty. But Martha knew something they didn't. The first cold didn't matter. The early frost didn't matter. Those were just signals. The real test would come later, when the wind didn't stop, when the temperature dropped low enough that every weakness in every structure became visible. That was when cabins failed, not because they couldn't create heat, but because they couldn't keep it. And when that moment came, when the valley faced the kind of winter that stripped warmth faster than fire could replace it, that was when they would understand. Not from what she said, but from what changed. Because Martha hadn't built thicker walls. She hadn't made a stronger fire. She had changed what reached her cabin in the first place. And once winter arrived, that difference would decide everything. The wind did not arrive all at once. It built, slow at first, just enough to bend the tops of the saplings and make the loose ends of Martha Ellery's shawl shift against her shoulder. Then it stayed. That was the part that mattered. Not the strength, the persistence. By the second day, it no longer felt like movement. It felt like pressure. A constant force pushing across the valley, carrying the cold with it, and stripping warmth from anything it touched. That was when most cabins began to fail. Not immediately, but gradually. Martha woke before sunrise on the third day of it. The fire in her stove had burned low overnight. A dull glow remained beneath the ash, nothing more. Last winter, that would have meant one thing. The room would already be freezing. She would have woken to stiff hands, frost lining the inside of the walls, and air so cold it made breathing uncomfortable. But that didn't happen. She sat up slowly, paying attention. The cabin wasn't warm, but it wasn't collapsing either. The air held. That was the first confirmation. She swung her feet to the floor. The wood was cool, but not biting, not pulling heat from her skin the way it used to. Martha stood and walked toward the northern wall, the one that had always suffered the worst. Last winter, that side had felt like standing near an open door. Now it felt still. She placed her hand against it and paused. The surface wasn't cold, not warm, but stable. That was the difference. The wind wasn't reaching it the same way. She added a single log to the stove, watched it catch slowly, feeding off the warmth that hadn't fully disappeared. That was new. Before, every fire had to rebuild from nothing. Now it continued. Outside, the valley told a different story. Martha stepped out briefly, pulling her shawl tighter. The wind struck immediately. Sharp, relentless. It didn't gust. It didn't ease. It pressed. The kind of cold that moved through layers and settled in the body. She looked toward the open field. Nothing stood between it and the rest of the valley. The air moved freely there. Fast, unbroken. Then she turned back toward her cabin, toward the rows of saplings. The difference was visible. The trees bent with the wind, but they didn't collapse. They absorbed it, split it, changed its direction. Snow gathered unevenly among them, piling in small drifts instead of being swept clean. That mattered. It meant the wind was losing energy before it reached the cabin. She stepped behind the first row. The pressure dropped immediately. Not gone, but reduced. By the second row, it softened further. By the third, it was something else entirely. Still present, but manageable. That was the system working. Not stopping the wind, breaking it. She returned inside and closed the door. Again, the shift was immediate. The cabin held. By mid-morning, the first knock came. Short, hard. Martha opened the door to find Turner standing there, shoulders tense against the cold. He stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind him. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stood there, breathing, letting his body adjust. It's not hitting the same, he said finally. No. He looked toward the walls. Then back at the door. You're not burning more wood. No. Turner stepped closer to the northern wall, pressed his hand against it. Waited. It's not freezing, he said. No. He turned slowly, taking in the space. It should be, he added. It was, Martha replied. That was the difference. Not imagined. Experienced. Turner walked back toward the door, then paused. Opened it slightly. The wind forced its way in, cold and immediate. He closed it again quickly, then looked at her. You changed the outside, he said. Yes. Not the cabin. No. He nodded once. Because now, he understood. Not fully, but enough. By afternoon, others began to notice. Smoke from nearby cabins rose thin and weak. Some fires were burning constantly, yet the interiors never held warmth. Because the wind never stopped taking it. Word spread quickly, not from explanation, from observation. People saw Martha's chimney, saw that it burned less. And they came, one by one, then in small groups. Not asking for shelter. Not yet. Just trying to understand. They stood behind the rows of saplings, feeling the difference, testing it, stepping forward into the wind. Then back again. One man shook his head slowly. It's quieter, he said. Yes, Martha replied. That's enough. It's everything. Because the problem had never been the cold alone. It was how fast it moved. That night, the wind didn't ease. It deepened, settled into something constant and unrelenting. This was where most cabins failed. Not during the day, but in the long stretch of night, when fires burned low, when people slept, when the wind continued its work without interruption. Martha reduced her fire deliberately, letting it drop lower than comfort demanded. Because she needed to know. The flame dimmed. The glow faded. And then, she waited. The air cooled. But not sharply. Not suddenly. The drop stretched. Slowed. The walls didn't lose heat the same way. Because the wind wasn't stripping it away. That was the difference. Not more heat. Less loss. Turner, who had stayed longer than planned, noticed it again. The fire's nearly gone, he said. Yes. But it's not falling. No. He looked toward the window. At the trees outside. Bending. Holding. Working. You didn't stop the wind, he said. No. You changed what it does. Yes. That was the realization. And once it settled, it stayed. The night passed without collapse. Without the sharp drop that had defined every winter before. The system held. Not perfectly, but consistently. And consistency meant survival. By morning, the valley had changed. Not visibly, but in behavior. People were moving differently. Watching the wind. Paying attention to where it moved fastest. And where it didn't. Some began gathering brush. Others cut small trees. Not building walls. Building barriers. Not to stop. To break. The cold held for 3 more days. Long enough to prove what worked. Long enough to change what people believed. When it finally began to ease, it did so quietly. The air softened. Movement returned. The pressure lifted. Martha stood outside her cabin that morning. The saplings were still there. Bent, but intact. Snow caught among them. Ground undisturbed behind. The system had held. Turner approached again. This time without urgency. He stopped beside her and looked out across the valley. They burned twice as much wood, he said. Yes. And still colder. Yes. He nodded slowly, then looked back at the rows of trees. You didn't make the cabin stronger, he said. No. You made the wind weaker. Martha shook her head slightly. I made it slower. That was the difference. And now, it was understood. Not as theory, as something real. Something felt. Something that had held when everything else struggled. She turned back toward the cabin. The door still warm. The air still steady. Because she hadn't fought the cold directly. She had changed what carried it. And once you do that, you don't need more fire. You don't need thicker walls. You don't need to fight harder. You just need to stop letting the cold arrive the same way. And in a place where survival depends on how long warmth stays. That changes everything.